The Meridian Hope drifted through the void between stars with 3,000 souls aboard and dreams of a new world waiting at journey's end. Captain. Maria Chen sat in her command chair reviewing the navigation charts when the proximity alarms screamed to life and her coffee went floating across the bridge in zero-gravity contact. Her sensor officer shouted with panic creeping into his voice. Unknown vessel decloaking at 3,000 kilometers and closing fast. Maria's hands moved across her console, bringing up the visual feed, and her stomach dropped when she saw the angular warship that looked like it was built from blades and hatred. Communications channel crackled open without her permission, and a face appeared on. The main screen with scales that shimmered purple and black, and eyes that held nothing but contempted tension. Human vessel, the alien said in perfect, if mechanical. Standard Galactic, I am Commander Velsha of the Creaful Sovereignty, and you are hereby ordered to prepare for boarding. Maria kept her voice steady, though her heart hammered against her ribs. Commander Velsha, we are a civilian transport on a registered route to Proxima Verity 3, and we carry no military cargo or personnel. Velsha S. Mouth twisted into something that might have been a smile on his species. Your cargo manifest indicates significant quantities of construction materials and advanced technology components which the sovereignty requires. Those materials are designated for colony construction, Maria said, and tried to keep the desperation from her voice. We have families aboard, and children and elderly colonists who— Silence, Velsha. Cut her off with a sharp gesture. You will transfer all cargo to our vessel immediately, or we will take it by force, and your compliance is not optional. Maria looked at her first officer, who shook his head slightly because they both knew the truth that a civilian transport had no weapons and no shields worth mentioning, and no way to outrun a military warship. We will comply, Maria said, and hated how defeated she sounded. Just please don't hurt anyone, and we'll transfer whatever you want. Velsia leaned back in his command chair and something flickered across his scaled features that looked like boredom mixed with cruel amusement. You misunderstand your position, human, and I think a demonstration is required to ensure your future cooperation. Wait, Maria stood up from her chair. We already agreed to give you everything, so what demonstration could you possibly, though? The channel cut off and Maria felt ice flood through her veins as she watched the Krathel warship's weapon systems come online and target not her bridge but the civilian cargo bay. Get everyone out of Bay 3, she screamed into the ship-wide intercom. Emergency evacuation now. But it was already too late because the Krathel boarding craft had already latched onto their hull and breached their outer airlock, and armed soldiers were pouring into the cargo bay where families had been organizing supplies for their new home. Screams came through the audio feeds and Maria could only watch in horror as the Krathel soldiers rounded up 27 people at random and forced them to kneel in a line while Commander Velsha's face reappeared on her screen. Watch carefully, Captain, he said with that terrible knot smile. So you understand the price of hesitation when the Creachel sovereignty makes demands. Maria wanted to close her eyes but couldn't look away as the soldiers raised their weapons, and she saw old Henry Martinez, who had been a teacher back on Earth, and young Sarah Kim, who was only 16 and traveling with her parents, and little Marcus Webb, who clutched a stuffed animal that his mother had made him. No, Maria whispered, please, no, we're complying. We're giving you everything, just please. The weapons fired and the audio cut out, but Maria could see the bodies falling, and the other colonists screaming silently behind the transparent cargo bay walls, and she felt something break inside her chest that she knew would never heal. Commander Velsha watched the execution with detached interest before turning his attention back to Maria's screen. Now, you understand the consequences of delay, and you will transfer all cargo within the next standard hour. You monster, Maria said, and her voice came out flat and dead. We were already complying, and those people were innocent, and you just murdered them for nothing. Not for nothing, Velsia corrected her. For efficiency and for the reputation of Creachel, strength, and to ensure that other human vessels know better than to waste our time with negotiations. Maria's hands shook as she began the cargo transfer procedures while her crew moved in, stunned. Silence around her, and the survivors in the cargo bay huddled together in shock and grief, Transfer took 43 minutes and Maria tracked every second. While silently promising the dead that someone would answer for this atrocity, when the last container drifted across to the Kretel vessel, Maria allowed herself one small hope that at least the killing was over and the survivors would live too. Reached their new home, Commander Velsha appeared on her screen one final time, and Maria felt fresh horror wash over her when she saw his expression shift to something darker. "Thank you for your cooperation, Captain," he said with mock courtesy. "However, I have decided that leaving witnesses would be disadvantageous too. Kretel interests in your vessel poses a potential security risk." "What?" Maria's voice cracked. "No, you have what you wanted, and we won't say anything. Just let us go, please. Your pleading is noted and dismissed," Velsia said. "Prepare to be destroyed, and may your death serve as a lesson about the futility of challenging." Kretel authority, the weapons lock alarm screamed, and Maria had just enough time to hit the emergency broadcast beacon before the first missile struck the Meridian. Hope's engine core, the ship, broke apart in a soundless explosion of metal and fire and dreams that would never be realized on a distant colony world. 3,000 people died in the span of heartbeats, while Commander Velsha watched with satisfaction and logged the incident as a minor piracy suppression action. What he didn't know was that a human stealth reconnaissance drone had been conducting routine patrol exercises in the neighboring system, and its sophisticated sensors had detected the Kretel ship's energy signature. The drone had moved closer to investigate, and its cameras had recorded everything from the initial contact to the final destruction. The footage began its journey back to Earth on automated quantum communication channels, while the debris of the Meridian Hope slowly scattered across the empty. Darkfellshaw turned his warship toward Kretel space and began composing his after-action report that would emphasize his decisiveness and strength while omitting certain details. About the nature of his targets, he felt satisfied with the day's work and anticipated commendations from his superiors, who valued officers willing to project power. Without hesitation, the drone's transmission reached the Sol system 47 hours later and was automatically flagged for immediate review by United Earth Coalition intelligence services. What happened next would change the galaxy forever. But in that moment, as the last fragments of the Meridian Hope tumbled through the void, Commander Velsha had no idea that he had just made the worst mistake in Kretel history. He had killed 3,000 humans who wanted nothing but peace and a new home, and humanity was about to remind the galaxy why peaceful species are not always the safe ones to provoke. The footage arrived at United Earth Coalition headquarters in Geneva at 0347 hours. On a Tuesday morning, and by 0400, every member of the Security Council had been woken by urgent priority alerts. Director Sarah Okonkwo watched the recording 3 times in her office while her hands gripped her desk hard enough to leave marks in the composite material. She had seen combat footage before during Earth's brutal unification wars decades ago, but something about watching civilians kneel in a cargo bay while alien soldiers executed them made her feel sick in ways that battlefield casualties never had. "Get me Admiral Kowali," she said into her unit, "and convene an emergency council session within the hour, and I don't care what time zones." Therein the recording spread through Earth's military and intelligence networks with controlled precision at first, but someone leaked it to the public networks, and within 6 hours, every human world had seen what happened to the Asterisk Meridian Hope. The reaction was immediate and visceral on Mars colony. Protesters gathered outside the Kretel Trade Embassy and demanded its immediate closure, while security forces struggled to prevent the crowd from turning violent, and Europa Station workers walked off their jobs at the orbital shipyards and refused to return until the government took action on Earth itself. Millions of people flooded into the streets of every major city with a unified message that humanity would not accept this atrocity. Without response, the Galactic Senate issued a standard statement expressing concern and calling for calm, and suggesting that diplomatic channels should handle the matter through proper procedures. Several alien ambassadors privately told their human counterparts that while the incident was regrettable, these things happened in space, and economic sanctions might be appropriate, but military actions seemed excessive. They fundamentally misunderstood what was building in the collective human consciousness. "Admiral, Jonathan Kowali stood before the United Earth Coalition Council 12 hours after the footage arrived, and his weathered face showed none of the fury that burned in his chest. The Kretel sovereignty has committed an act of unprecedented barbarity. Against our people, he said, without raising his voice.
Ow.
They murdered 3,000 civilians, including children, after those civilians had already surrendered and complied with their demands. What are our military options? From the Pacific Federation Cowl brought up a tactical display showing the disposition of forces. The Kretel maintain approximately 1,200 warships across their 17 core systems, while we currently have 314 vessels in active service. The numbers don't favor us, Counselor. Conquo observed. The numbers never tell the whole story, Kowali replied. The Kretel build their ships for traditional fleet engagements and territorial control, while our vessels were designed based on lessons from every conflict in recorded galactic history, explained, demanded Counselor Petrov from the European Alliance. Akali's expression shifted into something cold and calculating. We've spent 2 centuries studying how galactic powers fight each other, and we notice they all follow similar patterns because they all developed their military doctrines in similar environments. But Earth was different. He pulled up historical files showing conflicts from humanity's blood-soaked past. We come from a world where we fought ourselves for millennia and developed every conceivable form of warfare, from conventional battles to guerrilla insurgencies to cyber attacks to psychological operations, and we learned that the side with the most ships doesn't always win. The council members leaned forward as Kowali continued. The Kretel think they know what human military capabilities look like because we've shared some of our technology through standard diplomatic channels, but they've never seen our stealth systems or our cyber warfare capabilities or our drone technology because we classified those as defensive assets and kept them out of galactic databases. You're proposing we actually go to war with them? Counselor Martinez asked. I'm proposing we remind the galaxy that humanity chose peace not because we're incapable of war, but because we got better at it than anyone else. Quali said the Kretel need to learn that slaughtering our civilians has consequences. The debate lasted 6 hours, with various council members arguing for restraint and diplomatic solutions and economic pressure instead of military action, but the public pressure was enormous, and the footage of those executions kept playing on every news network, and the families of the dead were demanding justice, not negotiations. Finally, Director Okonkwo called for a vote on granting Admiral Kowali full military authority to respond to the Meridian Hope massacre. Resolution passed with only 2 abstentions. Scal was given an unprecedented mandate and unlimited access to Earth's military resources and authorization to use any means necessary, short of weapons of mass destruction. What's your first move? Okonkwo asked after the session. And Dead Kowal's smile was thin and dangerous. We're going to give them a chance to do the right thing, and when they refuse, we're going to teach them why you don't. Provoke a species that has been perfecting the art of killing for its entire existence. The message went out on all galactic frequencies exactly 60 hours after the Meridian Hope was destroyed, was simple and direct, with no diplomatic flourishes or legal terminology. Commander Velsha and the Kretel sovereignty are hereby notified that you have 72 hours to surrender those responsible for the massacre of 3,000 human civilians aboard the transport vessel Meridian Hope, and failure to comply will result in consequences. The Kretel High Council watched the message in their council chamber on their homeworld, and several members actually laughed. The humans are posturing, said High Counselor Tarek, with dismissive amusement. They have a handful of ships and no military tradition worth mentioning, and they think they can threaten us. Perhaps we should consider their request, suggested Counselor Mersha, who was younger and more cautious. The galactic community is watching and surrendering. One commander might absolutely. Not Tarak, cut her off. If we show weakness now, every minor species will think they can make demands, and the sovereignty's reputation will be irreparably damaged. What about their military capabilities? Asked another counselor. They have 300 ships against our 1,200, the military advisor said with confidence. And their technology is adequate but unremarkable, and their tactics are standard fleet doctrine, and they've never fought a real war against an external enemy. The High Council voted unanimously to reject the human ultimatum. They drafted a response that accused humanity of warmongering and threatened to file a complaint with the Galactic Senate. If humans took any aggressive action, Velsha himself was promoted to fleet commander and given command of a battle group as a show of support from the High Council. He accepted the promotion with pride and issued a public statement calling the humans emotional children playing at politics. The 72-hour deadline passed with no surrender. 3 hours and 17 minutes later, every Krethel military communications satellite in all 17 of their core systems simultaneously went offline. The blackout was total and immediate and inexplicably. Military technicians scrambled to diagnose the problem, but the satellites hadn't been destroyed or disabled by conventional weapons. They had simply stopped functioning, as if someone had reached into their code and turned them off from the inside. Admiral Kowali watched the confirmed reports from his command center aboard the Earth Defense Force flagship Indomitable and allowed himself a small, satisfied nod. Phase 1 complete, he said quietly. Now they're blind and confused and wondering how we did that, and they're about to learn that we're just getting started. Around him, his staff worked with calm efficiency, coordinating strike groups and cyber warfare teams and special operations units that were already moving into position across Krethel space. The war had begun not with explosions or grand fleet battles, but with a silent demonstration of capabilities that the Krethel never knew. Humanity possessed in the Krethel High Council chamber. The laughter had stopped as they stared at dead communications boards and tried to understand what was happening. They were about to receive an education in why underestimating humanity was a fatal mistake. Fleet Commander Velsha stared at the tactical display in his flagship's command center and tried to make sense of the chaos that it consumed. Krethel military operations over the past 3 weeks, still no communications with Sector Command. He demanded from his signals officer, "Negative, sir." The officer replied with barely controlled panic in his voice, "All satellite networks remain offline and hardline connections are experiencing intermittent failures, and our long-range transmitters are being jammed by an unknown source." Velsia slammed his fist against his command chair because nothing in his military training had prepared him for an enemy that refused to fight according to established galactic warfare conventions. The humans were supposed to mass their fleet and challenge Krethel forces in open battle, where superior numbers would decide the outcome quickly and decisively. Instead, we were doing something that no galactic military power had attempted in recorded history, because it simply wasn't how civilized species conducted warfare. They were fighting dirty. The first real engagement had occurred near the Atava Nebula, where Velsha had positioned his battle group to intercept reported human ship movements. His sensors had detected 3 human cruisers approaching, and he had ordered his 18 warships into standard combat formation, expecting a brief, if one-sided confrontation. The human ships had appeared on schedule, and Velsha had transmitted a demand for surrender before opening fire. Then the human ships vanished, destroyed or retreating, but literally disappeared from every sensor as if they had never existed. "Impossible," Velsha had shouted. "No stealth system can fool military-grade sensors at this range." He was wrong, though. Human ships reappeared 12 minutes later behind his formation and launched a devastating strike against his command vessel's engine core before vanishing again into sensor-invisible silence. Velsha's flagship had survived, but 3 of his escort vessels had suffered critical systems failures and begun venting atmosphere while their crews scrambled to seal hull breaches. When he tried to pursue the human ships, his sensors showed nothing, and his weapons found no targets. "Where are they?" he screamed at his sensor officer, who could only shake his head in confusion. Humans hit 2 more of his ships with precision missile strikes and destroyed the supply vessel before finally withdrawing without taking a single casualty. Velsha had filed a furious report with High Command. It's about human cowardice and dishonorable tactics, but the High Council was dealing with similar reports from commanders. Across all their territories, human forces were appearing without warning and striking critical targets and disappearing before Krethel ships could respond effectively. Supply convoys vanished in transit, and their cargo was never recovered, but their crews were found alive in escape pods with All weapons and military equipment stripped away. Communications hubs suffered mysterious system failures that credit. Technicians eventually traced two sophisticated cyber attacks that had penetrated supposedly secure networks. Admiral Command. Ships experienced hull breaches in the middle of the night from boarding actions that no sensors detected, and officers woke to find their computer cores wiped and their weapon systems sabotaged. The Cradle military was discovering that humans had spent 2 centuries not just studying galactic warfare, but identifying every weakness and vulnerability in how galactic powers fought. They learned from everyone's mistakes, muttered Velsha as tactical officer during one particularly frustrating. Briefing every failed campaign and every successful ambush and every tactical innovation from the last 1,000 years of recorded conflicts. Velsha wanted to dismiss this as excuse-making, but the evidence was overwhelming. Human forces used stealth. Technology that was decades ahead of anything in galactic databases, and their cyber warfare capabilities suggested they had been developing advanced AI systems in violation of several galactic conventions. Their ships weren't individually superior. 2 Krethel vessels in terms of raw firepower or defensive capabilities, but they fought with a coordination and adaptability that seemed almost prescient. It's their drone networks, explained the intelligence officer during a secure briefing. They're not just remotely piloted, but operate with distributed artificial intelligence that can make tactical decisions in milliseconds. That's illegal under Galactic Senate Resolution 7743. Velsha protested the humans never signed that resolution. The officer replied quietly. They claimed it was too restrictive for defensive applications, and now we know why the strategic situation deteriorated rapidly as weeks turned into a month. Krethel forces had lost nearly 40% of their operational fleet without destroying a single human capital ship. Most of those losses weren't from direct combat, but from supply chain collapse and coordination failures in ships that were disabled by sabotage and left drifting. The Krethel economy was suffering as human cyber attacks devastated financial networks and paralyzed interstellar trade. Colony worlds found themselves cut off not by blockade, but by precision strikes on key infrastructure that left populations intact, but governments unable to function. They're not trying to kill us, realized Counselor Mercia during an emergency High Council session. They're trying to break our ability to make war while minimizing civilian casualties. How is that even possible? Demanded High Counselor Tarak, who looked like he had aged a decade in the past month. War is supposed to be about destroying the enemy's capacity to fight. They are destroying our capacity to fight, Mercia said, but they're doing it by targeting our command and control, and our logistics and our economic foundation instead of our population centers. A military historian who had been brought in to consult on human tactics explained what was happening with Grim. Admiration Earth spent most of its history at war with itself, he said, while pulling up historical files. They developed warfare into an art form with thousands of different approaches depending on objectives and constraints. The display showed conflicts from human history ranging from ancient sieges to modern insurgencies to cyber warfare campaigns. When they joined the galactic community, they studied every major conflict in our records and noticed something we take for granted because we've never had an alternative perspective. What? Asked Tarek. That all galactic powers fight essentially the same way? The historian said fleet-based territorial control with similar ship designs and similar tactics and similar strategic objectives, because that's what works when you're fighting other species who developed in similar environments. But humans are different. Humans come from a single planet where they fought each other for survival. The historian continued they had to innovate constantly because their enemies were just as intelligent and adaptable as they were, and conventional approaches got countered immediately, so they learned to fight unconventionally. They learned to fight in every way possible, the historian corrected, and when they entered galactic space, they didn't abandon that knowledge. They just chose not to use it because they found something worth preserving. And now we've given them a reason to remember everything they chose to forget. Mercia said quietly. The galactic community was watching the conflict with growing alarm. The Orinthian Confederation issued a military analysis that concluded humans had been deliberately understating their capabilities during their integration into galactic society. The humans were never a minor power. The analysis stated they were a sleeping giant that chose to present itself as harmless to avoid threatening established powers. Other species began quietly reviewing their diplomatic relations with humanity and reconsidering trade agreements. In military postures, the Crethal High Council finally acknowledged reality when Fleet Commander Feltia's battle group suffered a devastating attack that disabled 11 ships in under 4 minutes. Human forces had deployed what appeared to be thousands of micro-drones that infiltrated Crethal vessels through exhaust ports and maintenance hatches and proceeded to sabotage critical systems simultaneously. We cannot win this war, Councillor Mersha stated flatly during the council session. Not through conventional military means, and possibly not at all. Then what do you suggest? Tarek asked, with defeat heavy in his voice. We appeal to the Galactic Senate, Mercia said. We frame ourselves as victims of human aggression and demand intervention. It was a desperate move, but the High Council voted to proceed. They drafted a formal complaint accusing humanity of violating numerous galactic conventions and using disproportionate force and conducting warfare in barbaric and uncivilized ways. The presentation was scheduled before the full Galactic Senate, and the Crethal delegation arrived, confident that galactic opinion would turn against the humans' fleet. Commander Velsha watched the proceedings from his damaged flagship and allowed himself hope that diplomatic pressure might achieve what military force could not. Was about to be disappointed in ways he couldn't imagine. The Galactic Senate chamber on the neutral station of Concordia Prime could hold representatives from 400 member species, and today every seat was filled. The Crethal delegation occupied the petitioner's platform, while Ambassador Treshkal prepared to present their case against human military aggression. Admiral Jonathan Kowali sat in the human delegation section with his uniform crisp and his expression neutral while he waited for the Crethal to finish their presentation. Treshkal spoke with practiced outrage about human violations of civilized warfare and disproportionate responses, and the barbaric tactics that had devastated Crethal military forces. The humans have demonstrated a complete disregard for established conventions. He declared they employ cyber warfare that violates our agreements on artificial intelligence, and they use stealth technology that makes honorable combat impossible, and they target infrastructure in ways that terrorize civilian populations. Several ambassadors nodded sympathetically because the Crethal narrative painted humanity as dangerous warmongers who needed to be restrained by galactic authority. We came to this Senate seeking justice and protection from a species that has revealed itself to be fundamentally hostile to galactic peace, Treshkal concluded. And we ask that sanctions be imposed and that human military actions be immediately curtailed. The Senate Speaker called for humanity's response, and Admiral Kowali rose from his seat and walked to the central platform with measured steps. He carried a single data tablet and nothing else. Honorable delegates, he began without preamble. The Crethal delegation has presented a compelling narrative about human aggression, and I would like to provide some context that was notably absent from their presentation. Kowali activated the main chamber display, and the footage from the Meridian Hope began to play. The chamber fell silent as delegates watched the Crethal warship intercept the human civilian transport and saw Commander Velsha's face as he demanded cargo and heard Captain Chen's attempts to negotiate peacefully. When the execution scene began, several delegates turned away, but Kowali's voice remained steady. 27 human civilians were murdered here, he said without inflection, including 5 children under the age of 10, and 7 elderly colonists over 80 years old, and 15 adults who had never seen combat in their lives. Footage continued, showing the final destruction of the Meridian Hope, and Kowali let the silence stretch after the explosion faded. 3,000 people died that day, he said. Not soldiers or combatants, but farmers and teachers and engineers. And children who wanted nothing more than to build a new home on a distant world. He changed the display to show Earth Coalition's initial diplomatic response. We filed formal protests through proper channels and requested that those responsible be held accountable, and we received this response from the Crethal High Council. The message appeared on the screen, and delegates read the dismissive language that characterized the incident as a minor enforcement action and suggested that Human vessels should be more compliant with Krathel authority. We then issued a warning, Kowali continued, 72 hours for the Krathel. Sovereignty to surrender Commander Velsha and the officers responsible for this massacre, and we were very clear about the consequences of refusal. He showed the Krathel high Council's response, which rejected the ultimatum and included several insulting references to human capabilities and resolve, so let me address the Krekel concerns. About our military tactics, Kowali said, and his voice took on an edge that made several delegates sit up straighter. Yes, we employ advanced stealth technology because we developed it specifically to avoid having to fight fair against numerically superior forces. Yes, we use cyber warfare because we learned centuries ago that disabling an enemy's ability to coordinate is more effective than destroying their ships one by one. Yes, we target infrastructure because we would rather collapse an enemy's capacity to make war than slaughter their soldiers and sailors, who are mostly just following orders. He paused and looked directly at the Kretel delegation. The Kretel accuse us of fighting dishonorably, but I would ask this chamber to consider what honor means to a species that executes surrendered civilians and then destroys their ship too. Eliminate witnesses. Ambassador Treshgal started to object, but the Senate Speaker silenced him with a gesture. Kowal brought up another display showing Krathel internal communications that human intelligence services had intercepted. These are private messages between members of the Krathel High Council discussing the Meridian Hope incident before our warning was issued. He said the delegates read jokes about teaching the upstart apes their place and dismissive comments about human military capabilities and strategic discussions about using civilian casualties to intimidate other minor species. The mood in the chamber shifted perceptibly. We asked for justice, Kowali said simply. We were mocked and we gave warning, and we were ignored, and so we demonstrated that peaceful and harmless are not synonyms. He closed his data tablet and addressed the chamber. With calm authority, humanity spent 2 centuries in this galactic community as quiet neighbors who traded fairly and resolved disputes diplomatically and contributed to scientific advancement and cultural exchange. We did this not because we lacked the ability to project power, but because we had learned through our own bloody history that violence should be a last resort. When all other options have been exhausted, the Kretel sovereignty destroyed our attempts at peaceful resolution. When they murdered 3,000 of our people and laughed about it in their private communications, Kowali's expression hardened. So yes, we went to war, and yes, we fought with every capability we possess, because when you force humanity to fight, we don't do it halfway, and we don't do it stupidly. The Kretel have lost 40% of their fleet with minimal casualties to their personnel because we targeted their ships and infrastructure rather than their people. They complain about cyber warfare, but we could have used weapons that would have killed millions. They complain about stealth technology, but we could have launched direct assaults on their homeworld. They complain about our tactics being uncivilized, but we have been remarkably restrained given the provocation. The chamber erupted in debate, but the Senate Speaker called for order and asked the question that many delegates were thinking: what does humanity want as resolution to this conflict? Kowali's answer was immediate. Commander Velsha and the 17 officers directly involved in the Meridian Hope massacre surrendered to face trial for war crimes and reparations paid to the families of the victims and acceptance of permanent monitoring to ensure Kretel military forces do not commit similar atrocities in the future. And if the Kretel refuse, the Speaker asked, then we will continue to dismantle their ability to threaten anyone until they have no choice but to comply. Kowali said we will not stop until justice is served. The Senate debated for 6 hours. While representatives consulted with their home governments and analyzed the evidence, Kowali had presented the Arenthian delegation led several others in condemning the Kretel actions and supporting humanity's right to seek accountability. Peltharian consensus argued for a mediated settlement, but struggled to suggest terms that humanity would accept. Kretel delegation became increasingly isolated, as former allies quietly distanced themselves from a conflict where the moral high ground belonged clearly to the humans. Finally, the Senate Speaker announced the decision: this body declines to intervene in the current conflict between humanity and the Kretel sovereignty, and further notes that the initial massacre of civilian humans appears to constitute a violation of multiple galactic conventions regarding the treatment of non-combatants. Ambassador Treshkal stood in shock as the implications sank and the Senate had effectively endorsed humanity's response and left the Krethel to face human military pressure without diplomatic support. Callie gathered his materials and prepared to leave when the Orinthian ambassador approached. Him privately, "You've changed how we all view humanity," she said quietly. "We thought we knew what kind of species you were." "You did know," Kawali replied. "We're exactly what we've always been, which is a species that prefers peace but remembers how to fight. That's what terrifies them." She gestured toward the Krethel delegation. The fact that you can be both. Kawali allowed himself a slight smile. "And perhaps they'll think twice before testing peaceful species in the future." The news reached the Krethel homeworld within hours, and the High Council convened an emergency session. High Counselor Tarek looked at his colleagues with resignation. "We have no choice but to accept human terms." Counselor Mercia nodded. "The alternative is the complete destruction of our military capability and economic collapse and possible occupation. How did we miscalculate so badly?" Another counselor asked. "We assumed that because humans were peaceful, they were weak," Mercia said. "We forgot. That peace is a choice, not a condition." The formal surrender offer went out that evening. Fleet Commander Velsha received the notification while his damaged flagship limped toward the nearest repair facility. He read the terms with growing dread and realized that he would be surrendered to human custody to face trial for war crimes. Fleet Commander Velsha sat in what the Krethel High Council had assured him was the most secure bunker on their homeworld, and tried to convince himself that the humans would never find him here. The facility was buried 3 kilometers beneath the planet's surface and protected by multiple layers of security, including biometric scanners and armed guards and sensor networks that would detect any approaching threat. He had been here for 4 days since the High Council officially surrendered him to human custody while their diplomats negotiated the terms of his transfer. Velsha harbored a secret hope that the negotiations would drag on long enough for public attention to shift, and for some compromise to be reached that would spare him from human justice. That hope died at 03 to 7 hours. When his security detail burst into his quarters shouting about an intrusion impossible, Velsha said while grabbing his sidearm, "Nothing can penetrate this facility without triggering every alarm in the complex." The alarms weren't sounding, and the facility's defensive weapons remained silent, and Velsia felt ice spread through his veins as he realized the humans had already disabled everything. He ran toward the command center, with his guards following close behind, and found the blast doors sealed shut from the inside. "Override the locks," he ordered, but his chief of security shook his head. "Someone rewrote the access codes," the officer said, with panic making his voice crack. "The entire security grid is responding to commands we're not sending." Velsia heard a soft hissing sound and turned to see a maintenance panel swing open in the corridor, while 6 figures emerged wearing black combat armor that seemed to absorb light and carrying weapons that made no sound when they moved. The lead figure spoke in perfect Krathel.
"Fleet Commander Velsia, you are under arrest by authority of the United Earth Coalition for war crimes, including the murder of
3,000 human civilians." LDS. Guards raised their weapons, but froze when red targeting lasers appeared on each of their chests. "Your security forces are unconscious," the human continued calmly. "Your automated defenses are offline, and your communication systems are under our control, and you have exactly 1 opportunity to surrender peacefully." "How did you get in here?" Velsia demanded, because his mind refused to accept what was happening. "We've been inside your bunker for 2 days, the human said, "studying your security protocols and mapping your systems, and waiting for authorization to extract you." Velsha looked at his guards, who slowly lowered their weapons and realized that resistance was pointless. The humans escorted him to the surface through corridors where Cradle security personnel lay sleeping from some kind of non-lethal gas and past disabled weapon systems, and through doors that opened at the humans' approach, as if welcoming Thema human stealth. Shuttle waited on the surface, and Velsha was secured in a passenger compartment before the craft lifted off and vanished from Krathel sensors. The entire operation had taken less than 8 minutes from initial contact to departure. Revla spent the journey to human space in silence, while contemplating the reality that his supposedly impregnable Sanctuary had been compromised by forces he never detected. The trial took place on a human military station orbiting Earth and was broadcast across the entire galaxy. On open channels, Velsha faced a panel of 3 judges, including 1 human and 1 Krathel, and 1 representative from the neutral Peltharian species. To ensure fairness, the evidence was overwhelming because the humans had recovered complete records from the Meridian Hope's systems and had testimony from Velsha's own crew members who had been present during the massacre. Vela's defense attorney argued that he was following standard Krethel military doctrine and that cultural differences made his actions understandable if not acceptable. Prosecution showed footage of the executions and played audio of Velsha's orders and presented testimony from survivors of other incidents where Kretel forces under his command had used excessive force against civilians. The verdict came after 3 days of deliberation, and all 3 judges agreed that Velsha was guilty of war crimes under both human and galactic. He was sentenced to life imprisonment in a maximum security facility with no possibility of parole or early release. 17 other Kreeth officers received similar sentences ranging from 20 years to life, depending on their level of involvement. Krathos sovereignty paid reparations totaling over 2 trillion galactic credits to the families of the Meridian Hope victims and accepted permanent human military observers to monitor their armed forces and prevent future atrocities. But the real consequences of the war extended far beyond legal judgments and financial penalties. The galactic community's entire understanding of humanity shifted in fundamental ways. Species that had dismissed humans as minor players suddenly scrambled to establish stronger diplomatic ties and trade relationships. Military alliances that had excluded Earth suddenly extended invitations to join their security frameworks. Orinthian Confederation offered humanity a permanent seat on their Strategic Defense Council, and several other powers made similar overtures. Ambassador Chen addressed the Galactic Senate 6 months after the war ended and tried to explain what had changed. Humanity has not become more aggressive. She said carefully, we have simply demonstrated capabilities we always possessed but chose not to advertise. Why the secrecy? Asked a delegate from the Ragalidian Compact. Because we learned from watching galactic history, Chen replied. Powers that appear too strong become targets for coalitions, seeking to limit their influence, and powers that appear too weak get exploited by those seeking easy victories. So you pretended to be average. We presented ourselves honestly as a peaceful species interested in trade and cultural exchange. Chen corrected, we simply didn't volunteer information about our military capabilities, because nobody asked, and we saw no reason to worry our neighbors. And now everyone knows, Chen said, and we hope that knowledge will prevent future incidents, like the Meridian Hope massacre, because other species will understand that attacking human civilians carries consequences. Admiral Kowali retired from active military service 8 months after the war ended and accepted a position as a visiting lecturer at the Orinthian Military Academy. His first lecture drew over 3,000 students from dozens of species who wanted to understand human military doctrine. Began with a simple question: what is the purpose of military force? The students offered various answers about defending territory and deterring enemies and projecting power. Kowal shook his head. Those are applications of force, but not its purpose. And the purpose of military force is to achieve political objectives. When diplomacy fails, he pulled up tactical displays from the Krethel War, noticed that every human operation was designed to pressure the Krethel government into surrendering war criminals and accepting accountability. We didn't try to conquer their territory, or destroy their civilization, or impose regime change, because those weren't our objectives. We wanted justice for murdered civilians, and we applied exactly enough force to achieve that goal. An Orinthian student raised his hand. But you could have destroyed them completely if you wanted. Yes, Kowali agreed. And that's precisely why we didn't, because the goal of warfare should be achieving your objectives, not maximizing destruction. He clicked to another display. Humanity spent thousands of years fighting ourselves, and we learned some hard lessons about the costs of total war and unlimited violence. We learned that today's enemy might be tomorrow's ally, and that unnecessary brutality creates cycles of revenge that last for generations, and that the most effective military forces are those that can apply violence precisely and discriminately. So when the Krethel massacred our civilians, we didn't respond with indiscriminate slaughter of their people. We responded by dismantling their ability to threaten us while minimizing casualties and preserving the possibility of future peaceful relations. That requires far more discipline and capability than simple destruction, another student asked the question. Many in the audience were thinking, where did humans learn to fight like this? Kowali's expression grew somber. We learned by fighting each other for our entire recorded history, and we developed every conceivable form of warfare, from primitive clubs to nuclear weapons, and from guerrilla insurgencies to cyber attacks. By the time we reached the stars, we had studied conflict from every possible angle and refined it into both an art and a science. When we joined the galactic community, we looked at how other species fought and realized they all followed similar patterns because they developed their military traditions. Fighting external threats, but humans are different because our worst enemies were always ourselves, and that forced us to innovate constantly because our opponents were just as intelligent and adaptable as we were. He paused and looked across the lecture hall. The Krethel made the mistake of thinking that peaceful meant harmless, and they learned the truth that humanity chose peace precisely because we had become so devastatingly good at war. The lecture continued for 3 hours and students left with a new understanding of why humanity had become the species that other powers watched most. Carefully, Admiral Kowali's final thought as he watched the